Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today we're diving into a world where the mind and body, well, they kind of seem to play tricks on each other. We're talking about somatic symptom and dissociative disorders.
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating. These disorders, they really show us how deeply connected our mental and physical experiences actually are.
It's like our brains are sending out these distress signals,
Hmm.
but they're not showing up in those typical ways that we'd expect, right?
Right.
And we've got some really interesting cases to dig into today too. We've got a woman who loses her memory every 6 months, a med student who's suddenly paralyzed, a dance teacher who feels like she's outside of her own body, and even a man who just vanished and built this whole new life for himself.
It's true. These cases, they might sound unbelievable, but they really offer a glimpse into just how complex the human experience is, and they show us the incredible power of the mind.
Okay, so let's start with those somatic symptom disorders. I think most people have probably felt physically sick when they're, stressed out or anxious. But what is it that makes it a disorder?
Yeah, so you're right. It's not just about having physical symptoms. I mean, everyone gets those, right? What really makes it a disorder is the level of worry and distress that these symptoms cause, even when there's no obvious medical explanation. It's like the anxiety just takes over and amplifies those physical sensations and then just disrupts your life.
So it's not about if the pain is real or not, but more about how that anxiety just kind of takes over everything.
Exactly. It's a good way to put it. So, for example, there's a case of this medical student and she was experiencing really severe abdominal pain. All the tests came back normal, but the pain was very real to her, and it turned out it was linked to her separation from her husband, purely an emotional trigger.
That's a perfect example of how stress can, manifest physically.
Yeah.
But there are different types of these disorders, right? What sets them apart from each other?
Absolutely. So let's start with somatic symptom disorder itself. And the hallmark of this is having one or more distressing physical symptoms that really disrupt your daily life. The key here is that the worry and the anxiety that surround these symptoms, they're out of proportion to what's actually happening physically.
Like the case of Linda. She felt like her symptoms were her entire identity, and she had this 5-page list of medical issues. It's really hard to imagine the constant fear and worry that must come with that.
Yeah, her case, it highlights just how all-consuming this disorder can be. Her symptoms, whether it was a headache or fatigue, became her entire world. And it's really important to remember that this preoccupation with physical symptoms it isn't about faking an illness. It's about the way that anxiety weaves itself into these physical sensations.
It's almost like the symptoms provide a sense of identity in a way, which is kind of sad but also really fascinating. What about someone who's always convinced they have a terrible disease, even when doctors tell them they're fine? Is that a type of somatic symptom disorder too?
You're describing illness anxiety disorder. So while there might be no or just very mild physical symptoms, the focus is really on the fear of having or acquiring a serious illness. Take Gail, for instance. Every little ache or pain sent her into a spiral of worry, convinced she had some life-threatening disease. It was the fear itself that became the dominant force.
It must be so hard to live with that level of anxiety just constantly looming, right? So how's illness anxiety disorder different from just being a hypochondriac?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the key difference is really the severity and the impact on your daily life. So with illness anxiety disorder, the fear is persistent, it's consuming, and it's really hard to shake off. Even with reassurance from doctors, they have this unshakable belief, this what we call disease conviction, that something is terribly wrong despite all evidence to the contrary.
This next one sounds truly mind-boggling. Conversion disorder, which I think used to be called functional neurological symptom disorder. It's where those physical malfunctions, they actually have no underlying medical cause, right?
That's right, yeah. It's like the body speaking a language that we don't quite fully understand. So think of Eloise, who suddenly lost the ability to walk, needed her mother's help for everything. But her symptoms were real. And doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong.
That's wild. Her symptoms were real, but there was no medical explanation. So what's the explanation then?
It's like the brain is sending signals that something is wrong, even though there's no physical damage. So in Eloise's case, this was a type of conversion symptom where her legs suddenly felt too weak to support her. But what's fascinating is it wasn't a conscious choice. It's as if her mind, maybe in response to some underlying stress, was creating this physical manifestation of her distress.
It really makes you wonder about the power of the unconscious mind, doesn't it? But how can you tell if someone's faking it? I mean, is conversion disorder different from malingering or those Munchausen stories you hear about?
Yeah, that's a really critical distinction. It can be tricky, but there are key differences. So, malingering involves consciously faking symptoms for some kind of external gain, like getting out of work or something. And then factitious disorder is more about intentionally producing symptoms, but not for any obvious external reward. It might be for attention or to assume that, like, sick role.
So in conversion disorder, there's no conscious deception. It's something else completely.
Exactly. The symptoms are very real to the person experiencing them, but they're not intentionally produced. It's as if the mind is protecting itself in some way, but the cost is this physical manifestation of that distress. And take the case of Celia, a girl who suddenly lost her vision. Tests showed that her brain was actually processing visual information, but she wasn't consciously seeing.
That's really interesting. It's almost like her mind was blocking her from consciously seeing, even though her brain was still working. What could cause something like that?
Well, that's one of the mysteries we're still trying to unravel, right? It suggests the unconscious mind plays a really powerful role in shaping our experiences, even in ways we don't fully understand.
It's truly remarkable how complex and interconnected the mind and body are. Speaking of mysteries of the mind, let's shift gears to those dissociative disorders. The ones where people experience disruptions in their sense of self, their memory, even their perception of reality.
Absolutely. So if those somatic symptom disorders are about the mind's influence on the body, those dissociative disorders, they're about the mind becoming fragmented or detached from itself or from the world.
I've definitely had those moments where I felt spaced out or disconnected, especially when I'm tired. Is that normal or is it a sign of something more serious?
Most people have those transient dissociative experiences, especially when you're stressed or fatigued. It's when those feelings become persistent, disruptive, and interfere with your life that it might indicate a disorder.
So like most things in mental health, it's about the degree and the impact, right? There's a spectrum.
Exactly. So let's start with depersonalization derealization disorder, where those feelings of unreality, they become really intense and dominate your life. Bonnie, a dance teacher, is a good example. She felt like she was watching herself teach from outside her body, and she even experienced that tunnel vision, like everything was closing in.
It sounds terrifying to feel so detached from yourself and your surroundings. What causes those feelings of unreality to become so intense?
Well, the exact causes are still being researched, but we do know that trauma, stress, and anxiety, they can play a significant role. It's as if the mind is trying to protect itself by detaching from these overwhelming experiences. But the cost is this persistent feeling of being disconnected from reality.
What about when people can't remember things? Is that always a medical issue or can it be psychological too?
It absolutely can be psychological. And that brings us to dissociative amnesia, where the inability to recall important personal information, usually related to traumatic or stressful events, is the defining feature. So imagine there's this mother who completely lost her memory after every intense family fight. Like her mind just seemed to block out those painful experiences.
Wow, that's almost like a self-protective mechanism, right?
Yeah.
But it must be so disorienting to go through that. Are there different types of this dissociative amnesia?
There are. So you have generalized amnesia, where a person forgets their entire past. Then there's localized amnesia, where they can't recall specific events, often traumatic ones. And then selective amnesia, where they remember some but not all details of a specific period. And then there's this fascinating phenomenon of dissociative fugue.
Dissociative fugue. That's the one where people just suddenly take off and end up in a new place with no memory of how they got there, right? Like Jeffrey Ingram, who disappeared and started a whole new life.
Yes. Jeffrey's case is a classic example. So he was facing immense stress due to a friend's terminal illness, and then he vanished and ended up in Denver, completely unaware of his identity or his past life. It's like his mind created this escape route from this unbearable situation.
That's both terrifying and amazing how the mind can protect itself that way, even if it means, losing your identity and your memory.
Mm.
Okay, now for the disorder that's often like shrouded in mystery and sensationalized in movies, dissociative identity disorder, DID, used to be called multiple personality disorder, right?
Right. But DD is far more complex than what you see in movies. It's not about these dramatic personality shifts for entertainment. It's about this fragmentation of identity, where a person experiences two or more distinct personality states, each with its own ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving.
So it's like different parts of the personality are splitting off, almost creating these separate identities to cope with something really overwhelming. But how can you tell if it's real or if someone's just putting on an act?
That's a really valid concern, and that's why diagnosing DD is so challenging. The key is a thorough evaluation, looking for these consistent patterns of dissociation, amnesia, and those distinct identity states that can't be explained by other factors. It's not about theatrics, but rather this really profound disruption in the sense of self, often stemming from a history of severe trauma.
Trauma seems to be this recurring theme in a lot of these disorders.
You're right. Trauma, particularly early childhood trauma, is a significant risk factor for developing those dissociative disorders. It's as if the mind, in its attempt to protect itself from these overwhelming experiences, creates these divisions or detachments as a way to cope.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've covered the basics of somatic symptom and dissociative disorders, and it seems like there's still so much that we're learning about them.
Absolutely. Research is constantly evolving, shedding new light on the complexities of the mind-body connection and those profound ways that trauma can shape our experiences.
Well, this has been a really insightful journey so far. I'm really eager to delve deeper into the causes and the treatments for these disorders.
Well, stay tuned because next we'll untangle the web of factors that contribute to these conditions and explore the promising therapies offering hope for healing and recovery. So, welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were exploring that fascinating and often perplexing world of somatic symptom and dissociative disorders. Now let's shift gears a little bit and delve into what causes these conditions.
All right, let's untangle this web. Is there like one single root cause, or is it a lot more complicated than that?
Oh, it's definitely more of a complex interplay of factors. Researchers believe there's this combination of biological, psychological, and social influences all kind of contributing to their development. Like, think of it as these pieces of a puzzle all fitting together.
Okay, so let's start with those somatic symptom disorders. Where do we even begin with those?
Well, one theory suggests that people who develop these disorders, they might have this heightened sensitivity to physical sensations. They're more in tune with their body signals than the average person.
So they're just more aware of their bodies, is that all?
It's not quite that simple. Remember that medical student whose abdominal pain was linked to stress? It's possible these individuals, they have a lower threshold for just noticing those physical sensations. A minor headache that most people might ignore could send them into a spiral of worry.
So it's like their internal alarm system is set to a higher sensitivity, and they're more likely to interpret any little physical sensation as like a threat.
Exactly. And this heightened awareness, it can turn into this vicious cycle. The more they focus on those bodily sensations, the more intense they become, fueling their anxiety and then leading to even more preoccupation with their health.
It's like this huge snowball effect where the worry just amplifies the whole physical experience.
You got it. But there's more to this puzzle. Cognitive factors, like the way we think and interpret information, they also seem to play a role. For example, people with somatic symptom disorder might have this tendency to catastrophize.
Catastrophize, meaning they always think the absolute worst is going to happen.
That's the gist of it, yeah. They jump to the most dire conclusion, even if there's very little evidence to support it. Like Gail, who was convinced that every sniffle was a sign of a deadly disease. So this cognitive bias, this tendency to misinterpret physical sensations as threatening, it really fuels the fire.
It's interesting how these disorders, they involve this complex dance between physical sensations, thoughts, and emotions, all feeding off each other.
Absolutely. Now let's add another layer to this puzzle. Learning and early life experiences. Some researchers think that people with somatic symptom disorder might have learned to focus on their physical health because it was like a way to get attention or avoid responsibilities in the past.
So like if a child learns that being sick gets them sympathy and special treatment, that could set the stage for developing this kind of disorder later on.
That's the idea. Think back to Eloise, whose inability to walk coincided with her mother needing her help at home. And while she wasn't consciously faking those symptoms, the attention and care she received might have unintentionally reinforced her conversion disorder.
It's such a fascinating example of how early experiences can really shape our whole relationship with our bodies and our health in general. What about genetics? Do genes play a role in these conditions at all?
There is some evidence to suggest that a genetic predisposition could increase someone's vulnerability. Studies have shown that these somatic symptom disorders, they tend to run in families, hinting at a hereditary component.
So it's not one single gene, but rather a combination of genetic factors that might make someone more susceptible.
Exactly. It's likely a complex interplay of multiple genes, much like we see with a lot of other mental health conditions. And to add yet another layer of complexity, cultural influences can also shape how these disorders manifest.
Cultural influences. How so?
Well, culture shapes our understanding of health and illness, right? And it can really influence how we express distress. For example, in some cultures, it's much more acceptable to express emotional distress through physical symptoms than through direct emotional language.
So someone might say they have a stomach ache when they're really feeling anxious or stressed.
Precisely. And this isn't necessarily a conscious choice either. It's often just ingrained in that culture's way of understanding and communicating about distress.
That's such a good reminder that, like, context matters and that we need to be really mindful of those cultural differences when we're talking about mental health. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the causes of those dissociative disorders. What are some of the leading theories in this area?
Well, the prevailing theory, particularly for Day, it really centers around trauma, especially severe and prolonged childhood trauma. So dissociation is thought to be a coping mechanism, a way to mentally escape from these unbearable experiences.
So it's like the mind's creating these separate identities or alters as a way to shield the person from the full force of that trauma.
That's the core idea, yeah. Each alter, they might hold different memories, emotions, or behaviors related to that trauma,
Mhm.
effectively compartmentalizing the experience to help the person just, survive psychologically.
It's a heartbreaking but really powerful illustration of, like, the resilience of the human spirit, but also a stark reminder of the huge impact that trauma can have on someone's life.
You've captured the duality of it perfectly. Now, in addition to trauma, there's this growing recognition of the role of suggestibility in dissociative disorders, particularly D-Day.
Suggestibility. What does that mean in this context?
It means that people with DD, they tend to be more easily influenced by others, particularly therapists. And this has led some researchers to suggest that DD could, in some cases, be unintentionally reinforced or even shaped by therapists during treatment.
So a therapist, with the best of intentions, might accidentally suggest the existence of alters, and the patient, being highly suggestible, might internalize those suggestions.
That's the concern, yeah. And it highlights how important it is for therapists to be incredibly careful and aware of those power dynamics that exist in therapy.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a delicate balance, wanting to help someone explore their experiences, but also being mindful of not, like, leading them down a certain path. And what about biological factors? Are there any, like, brain-based differences that might make someone more susceptible to developing these dissociative disorders?
Research in this area is still emerging, but some interesting findings are starting to surface. Neuroimaging studies have shown that individuals with DD tend to have structural and functional differences in certain brain regions compared to those without the disorder.
So are we talking about physical differences in the brain, or more about how different parts of the brain are communicating with each other?
Likely a combination of both. For instance, some studies have found that people with DID, they tend to have smaller hippocampi, which is the brain area responsible for memory, than those without the disorder.
So could this smaller hippocampus be related to those memory gaps and the fragmented sense of self that we often see in DID?
That's one possibility. It's also possible that these brain differences, they're not necessarily present at birth, but they actually develop over time as a result of trauma and chronic dissociation. It's kind of a complex chicken or the egg question that researchers are still trying to answer.
It's a good reminder that the brain is constantly changing and adapting in response to our experiences, both the positive and the negative ones.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful look into the causes of these really complex conditions.
And we've only just scratched the surface. Next, we'll explore the treatments for these disorders and discuss how individuals can find healing and recovery. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been exploring this really intricate world of somatic symptom and dissociative disorders, kind of uncovering their diverse forms and that complex web of factors that can contribute to their development. Now, let's turn our attention to the treatments that offer hope for healing and recovery.
Yeah, and it's really important to remember that these are very real and often debilitating conditions. But the good news is they are treatable. With the right approach, individuals can learn to manage those symptoms, process trauma, and really regain that sense of wholeness.
That's definitely encouraging to hear. So where do we even begin with treatment for something as complex as, somatic symptom disorder?
Well, one of the most effective approaches is something called cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
CBT, that's the therapy that focuses on changing those unhelpful thought patterns and behaviors, right? How does that apply to someone who's like preoccupied with their physical health?
That's exactly it. So, in the context of somatic symptom disorder, CBT can help individuals identify and challenge those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that just fuel their fixation on physical symptoms. It's about breaking that cycle of catastrophic thinking, reassurance seeking, and doctor hopping.
So instead of thinking this headache must be a brain tumor, they learn to kind of question those thoughts and consider maybe some more realistic explanations.
Precisely. CBT helps them develop a more balanced perspective on their bodily sensations, and it empowers them to really manage their anxiety in a more constructive way.
It's like they're learning to be detectives of their own bodies, kind of questioning the evidence and looking for those alternative explanations. What about medication? Is there a role for that at all in treating these disorders?
Well, while therapy is usually the first line of treatment, medication can be helpful in some cases, particularly if anxiety or depression are also significant factors. Antidepressants, especially SSRIs, can really help to reduce anxiety, improve mood, which can make it a lot easier to engage in therapy.
So the medication isn't like directly targeting those physical symptoms, but more addressing that kind of underlying emotional distress.
Exactly. It's about managing that emotional component that can make those physical sensations feel so overwhelming and so threatening.
Makes sense. Now let's talk about treatment for dissociative disorders. These conditions, especially DD, seem incredibly challenging to treat, just given that fragmented sense of self and the potential for re-traumatizing the individual.
You're right, it's a very delicate process that really requires the therapist with specialized training and experience in trauma-informed care. The primary goal is to help that individual process their trauma, develop some coping skills for managing those dissociative symptoms, and then ultimately work towards integrating those different parts of themselves.
So it's not about like eliminating the alters altogether, but more helping them to communicate or cooperate with each other, kind of form a more unified sense of self.
That's a great way to put it. The therapist acts as a guide, creating that safe space for the individual to explore their inner world, confront those traumatic memories, and then gradually piece together those fragmented parts of themselves.
It sounds like a really long and challenging process.
Yeah.
Are there any specific therapies that are particularly effective for treating DID?
Well, several therapies have shown promise, including dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. Both of those are particularly helpful for processing trauma and managing that emotional dysregulation.
It's encouraging to know that there are effective therapies out there to help people with DID really heal and move forward.
Yeah.
What about like the broader impact of these disorders? It seems like they would affect, not just the individual, but their families and relationships as well.
You're absolutely right. Living with these disorders can be incredibly isolating, both for the individual and their loved ones. Imagine trying to support a partner who is convinced they have a serious illness despite all medical evidence, or a child who is experiencing those sudden personality shifts.
It must be so confusing and heartbreaking for families to navigate those situations.
It can be. That's why it's really important for families to have access to education and support. Understanding these disorders can help reduce stigma, improve communication, and really strengthen those support systems.
It seems like there's still a lot of stigma surrounding mental illness in general, and these disorders are probably no exception.
Yeah, you're right. There's often a lack of understanding, and people with these conditions can be misjudged or dismissed as being attention-seeking or dramatic. It's important to remember that these are very real, complex disorders with a biological basis. They're not a choice.
Absolutely. Education is so crucial to combating that stigma and promoting empathy. So what does the future hold for our understanding and treatment of these conditions?
Well, the research is really expanding. We're learning more and more about those brain mechanisms that are involved, which is paving the way for more targeted and effective treatments.
Are there any specific areas of research that you find particularly exciting or promising?
Well, there's this fascinating research exploring the role of the gut microbiome in somatic symptom disorders. It seems that those gut bacteria might actually play a role in inflammation and pain sensitivity, potentially contributing to the development of those conditions.
The gut microbiome. Wow, that's amazing. It seems like we're discovering new connections between our gut health and our overall well-being all the time. What are the potential implications of this research, do you think?
Well, if the gut microbiome isn't indeed involved, it could open up this whole new avenue for treatment, right? Imagine being able to use dietary changes or probiotics to modify those gut bacteria and reduce those symptoms.
That's incredibly exciting. It feels like we're really just beginning to scratch the surface of understanding those complexities of the mind-body connection.
We are, and that's what makes this field of study so fascinating. There's just so much that we're still learning, and each new discovery just brings us closer to providing more effective and compassionate care for those struggling with these disorders.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening journey into the world of somatic symptom and dissociative disorders. What are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with today?
I'd say the most important takeaway is that these disorders are real, they're treatable, and there's always hope for recovery. We need to move beyond that stigma and embrace a more compassionate understanding of these very complex conditions.
Absolutely. Education is key to breaking down those misconceptions and fostering that more supportive and understanding environment. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, just remember that the mind and body are intricately connected. These disorders are a real testament to the profound ways our experiences, especially trauma, can shape our physical and emotional well-being.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. This has been a truly fascinating and informative deep dive into the mysteries of the mind and body.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We encourage you to continue exploring. Research, reflect, and engage in conversations that challenge stigma and promote a more nuanced understanding of these often misunderstood conditions. Until next time, stay curious and keep those minds and hearts open.